So this is a talk. It's a talk on a specific kind of correspondence theory of truth. So I want to start by saying a little bit about correspondence theories in general. There really isn't a single thing that is called the correspondence theory of truth. Rather, there's a genus of views that are loosely connected by family resemblance. Historically, correspondence theories were always expressed by platitudes. So for example, Aristotle wrote that to say of what it is, say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false. While to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that is not, is true. Sometime later, St. Thomas Aquinas said the truth is conformity of thing and intellect. Later still, Bertrand Russell and G. Moore, they argue that truth is a matter of beliefs corresponding with the facts. Well, in their respective contexts, these platitudes were always meant to signal rejection of some other more unpalatable view. So these early correspondence theories would say these things in order to distance themselves from the idea that truth is in the eye of the beholder, or a mere matter of opinion, or whatever is most useful to believe. Each of these platitudes gives voice to the same basic thought that is shared by all those who travel under the correspondence label. The truth is a matter of accurately representing how things are in the world. Traditionally, the philosophers who developed this thought have looked to metaphysics and ontology, particularly to the notions of proposition and fact. Hence, in the early 20th century, especially in Frege, Russell, and early Wittgenstein, much of the effort towards theorizing about correspondence truth was poured into developing a metaphysics of propositions and facts. However, in the 1970s, another strain in the correspondence tradition emerged. It was spearheaded by Hartree-Field's 1972 paper, Tarski's Theory of Truth. Inspired by earlier work from Alfred Tarski, Field proposed that correspondence theorists should use techniques from formal semantics to first define truth in terms of reference, and then seek an empirical reductive account of reference drawing from cognitive science and the philosophy of language. Following Field, this approach was defended by Michael Devitt and endorsed by Jerry Fodor. So how can a theory of truth emerge from these formal and empirical traditions? Well, here's a very simple illustration. Take the sentence, Momo sleeps. So here's how we explain its truth. It's true because first, Momo refers to Momo, and Momo is my cat. Sleeps applies or refers to those that sleep. The sentence structure encodes predicating sleeps upon the reference of Momo. And finally, Momo is sleeping. So in short, the sentence is true because its subsentential parts refer to things, and those things are as the sentence represents them to be. So here's like a picture of the fourth element of this explanation. There is my cat sleeping. So this simple picture is fine as far as it goes, but the hard problem for theorists is to develop it into something that's systematic and actually revelatory. I'm going to use the name reference first to cover any theory that extends this basic strategy to cover all kinds of truth of any order of complexity or subject matter. Such a theory will hold that for any true sentence, its truth is explicable by what its parts refer to and how those parts compose together. The idea is that we can explain the sentence level property of truth on the basis of the lexical level semantic relation reference. So I call this approach reference first because it puts reference before truth in the overall explanation. The bold claim made by a reference first theorist is that this recipe, once suitably extended, will completely capture the nature of truth. So one of my highest philosophical ambitions is to defend something in the ballpark of this view, but because I think that it has a lot going for it. Besides its obvious intuitive appeal, it also promises a unifying and systematic theory of truth that harmonizes with several tractable, fruitful enterprises, like formal semantics and cognitive science. But defending this approach is a big task, and it's been going on for quite a long time. So in this talk, I just want to make a small contribution towards that end. So here's my plan. First, I'm going to talk about Hartree-Field's theory from the 1972 paper. As we'll see, his theory faces several objections, many of which are the product of his auxiliary philosophical commitments. Secondly, I'm going to propose a modified version of the theory. My central claim is that there's really only one principle that defines the reference first view, and it concerns what I'll call metasemantic orientation, but it doesn't concern ontology or the nature of reference. So this claim presupposes this distinction between semantics and metasemantics, and I'm going to have to explain what that is. After proposing this, I'm going to explain how my modified version can overcome the problems of afflicted field. And following this, if I get to it, I'll compare my view to other views in the contemporary landscape. Okay, so let's start with field on Tarski. So reference first theory, it must explain how truth is determined by reference. And for simple subject predicate sentences, like the one I gave, it's extremely obvious how to provide this account. So here's the account. Sentences of the form A is F or A is F, AFs are true if and only if the predicate F applies to the referent A. And then I state Momo refers to Momo, and sleeps applies to those that sleep. Notice that this simple account does two things. First, the first principle, it effectively reduces truth of subject predicate sentences to the reference and application of their parts. And principles 2 and 3 state the reference and application conditions for those two words. Now, this simple theory doesn't look all that impressive yet, but the reason it doesn't look all that impressive is because I chose an extremely simple example. Things would not be so easy if I chose an example with a bit more complexity, such as quantified sentences, like all dogs bark, or Momo is the only cat that I own. But it turns out that it is possible to perform the very same trick for these sentences. The technique was pioneered by Alfred Tarski in the 1920s and 30s. Here's the paper. So this paper is now, it's like revered as one of our holy texts in analytic philosophy. In this paper, Tarski accomplished for a wide class of sentences what I accomplished for Momo sleeps. That is, he defined the sentence level property of truth for a given language, a given formal language, in terms of word-object relations like reference, which allows one to then completely define truth for that language by stating the reference and application conditions for its primitive names and predicates. The reason that this took a little bit of genius had to do with the quantifiers, all and some. It's not immediately obvious how to work with them. So here's an English sentence, all dogs bark. How do you define truth for this sentence in terms of the reference of dogs and bark? Well, this is a sentence of natural language, English. And so Tarski doesn't define truth for it directly. Instead, he considers a related sentence in a rigorously defined formal language, L, this quantified sentence here. And then we can define truth for that quantified sentence in terms of the satisfaction of an open subformula. Roughly, the quantified sentence is true if the subformula is satisfied by all the relevant sequences of objects. So here's Tarski's definition in full generality. It applies to a rigorously defined formal language, and it's on your handout. It contains base clauses that state reference for names and predicates, and then recursive clauses that show how to derive truth conditions for complex sentences on that basis. I'm not going to go through the details. It doesn't matter if I go through the details all that much. I just have to make some clarifications about what Tarski did and didn't accomplish. Tarski's method can define truth for sentences that have a large order of complexity, but only if they belong to a highly circumscribed class of languages with well-defined syntactic structure. You can see this even in the definition here. The sentences have to have those sentential connectives and quantifiers. Paradigmatically, these are the languages, those idealized, simplified languages that you would learn in a first or second year logic course. Natural languages that humans actually speak are a lot more complicated than this. So it's uncontroversial that Tarski's method works for the formal languages he concerns himself with. However, it's one thing to define truth for a particular formal language, and quite another to give a general philosophical account of truth, needless to say. A general philosophical account of truth that would be applicable to natural language or thought. So this is where Hartree-Field enters the picture. Field, unlike Tarski, is explicitly concerned to define truth for natural spoken languages. He's also concerned to define truth for the hypothesized system of mental representations that underlies cognition, and thereby explain truth for thoughts, beliefs, desires as well. At the time that Field was writing, the prevailing opinion was that Tarski's theory succeeded in reconciling semantics and truth with a broadly scientific worldview. And this broadly scientific worldview is one where everything is supposed to ultimately be reducible to physics. So facts about people, including languages, is supposed to be somehow reducible to facts about our biology, and biology is supposed to be reducible to chemistry, and then reducible to physics. Tarski's theory allegedly achieved this because it showed how to define truth and reference without mentioning truth or reference. It showed how to define it in non-semantic terms. Given the Tarskian definition that you see on the handout, you can rearrange it to get a formula that looks like this, where it says for all sentences in a language, they're true in that language, if and only if, and then it doesn't mention truth or reference on the right-hand side. Since no semantic notions are mentioned in the definition, it follows that such a definition would be consistent with an austere naturalist or physicalist worldview, where everything is ultimately reducible to physical properties. And Field shares this motivation. He worries about notions that can't be explained by the fundamental sciences. However, he argues that Tarski's definition, as it by itself, doesn't achieve this for the primitive facts or primitive semantic facts for natural language. It wasn't ever Tarski's intention to explain those. So the issue revolves around the base clauses. In a Tarskian definition, when you define truth and reference, when you define reference, you essentially do so by giving a list of name and referent pairs. You might list off Momo refers to Momo, Bean refers to Bean, Luna refers to Luna, and so on. And now, if all I'm doing is characterizing a formal language, then this is really all I need to say. Since formal languages are our own creations, we can stipulate their terms to mean whatever we like. However, if, like Field, contrary to Tarski, we're also interested in characterizing reference for natural spoken language or for mental representations and concepts, then these would report empirical facts that need further explanation. Reference in a spoken language is somehow determined by the usage of speakers, and reference for mental representations is somehow determined by a subject's relation to their environment. But a Tarskian theory never aims to explain how any of that works. That's just not its job. So for this reason, Field argues that we cannot rely on a purely Tarskian theory for a general account of truth. Nonetheless, Field sees Tarski's theory as composed of two detachable parts. It comprises the list-like accounts of reference and application, the base clauses in the handout, and it has those recursive clauses that define satisfaction and truth for complex expressions. According to Field, the sole philosophical significance of Tarski's theory resides squarely in the latter component, in those recursive clauses. He thinks that these clauses allow us to define the property of truth in terms of reference. In Field's opinion at the time, Tarski's chief philosophical achievement was that he reduced the problem of explaining truth to the problem of explaining reference. So this suggests to Field that truth itself can be defined in two parts. The first part is you take Tarski's recursive clauses, These serve to define truth in terms of reference. The second part is you supplement those base clauses with a general reductive account of reference. So such an account, it should explain how words come to refer to objects by actually mentioning facts about how speakers use their terms. Moreover, the theory should be general in that it should apply to arbitrary terms of arbitrary languages, not just the finitely many terms of predefined languages. Finally, Field argued that the account needs to reduce reference to non-semantic relations. His motivation for this goes back to a point from earlier. He was a physicalist. For him, the philosophical purpose of giving a definition of truth is to reconcile semantics with the view that everything's ultimately physical, to bring it into harmony with the more rigorous sciences. He even writes that if we were to ever conclude that it was impossible to explicate the notion of truth and reference in non-semantic terms, we'd either have to give up these semantic terms or else reject physicalism. Here's another great quotation saying the same thing, except this one's by Jerry Fodor. But Fodor, at least on truth, basically agrees with Field. Fodor says, I suppose that sooner or later, the physicists will complete the catalog they've been compiling of the ultimate and irreducible properties of things. When they do, the likes of spin, charm, and charge will perhaps appear upon their list. But aboutness, a reference, surely won't. Intentionality simply doesn't go that deep. It's hard to see in the face of this consideration how one can be a realist about intentionality without also, to some extent, being a reductionist. If the semantic and the intentional are real properties, it must be in virtue of their identity with properties that are themselves neither intentional nor semantic. If aboutness is real, it must be something else. So in summary, a Fieldian theory supplements Tarski's with another definition, something that ought to look like this, where for all terms and objects, you define reference by identifying it with some other relation, a relation that doesn't require mentioning any semantic notions. But the big question, of course, is what is that relation? What is that something else that reference reduces to? Field gives a few suggestions in the 1972 paper. Since he's writing in the 70s, he's optimistic that this template could be filled out by expanding the newly causal theories of reference from Kripke and Putnam. So he also suggests that the mechanisms of reference are likely to be uncovered by investigations in cognitive science and neuroscience. I think he had in mind something like this toy idea. Like, take my concept of a cat. Why does this concept refer to cats? Well, it's because whenever I perceive a cat, that concept, or my perception of a cat causes that concept to become activated in my head. Now, of course, that's like a toy idea. However, after Field's paper, there was a great deal of effort to expand it into something more rigorous. This causal informational theory was developed by Stamp, Dretske, and Fodor. Okay, so that's the historical precedent. I'm just going to take a moment to reflect and say, I think that there's lots to like about this view. For one, unlike the older correspondence theories, the ones on the first slide, this doesn't at all have the character of an empty platitude. It actually carries a lot of explanatory depth. That is because it has the potential to explain for a potentially infinite number of sentences how their truth conditions depend on their composition and the representation relations of their parts. Secondly, past correspondence theories tended to rely on shaky metaphysical claims about propositions and facts. Field's theory, by contrast, doesn't presuppose any controversial ontology. It only requires the existence of ordinary objects, like cats, for the names to refer to and our predicates to apply to. You can pair Field's view with pretty much any ontology you like, even a suspect ontology. But you don't have to pair it with a controversial ontology. There's nothing inherent with the view that requires it. Thirdly, Field's approach promises to integrate the theory of truth with several fruitful and tractable scientific enterprises. such as like the formal semantic theory provided by Tarski, and then also these theories of representation from Stamp, Dretske, and Fodor. So for these reasons, Field's theory has become something of a standard bearer for correspondence theory, the correspondence theory of truth. Even today, when writers talk about the correspondence theory, they often cite Field's paper. However, the theory is far from perfect. I'm now going to present 4 objections to it, but even though I'm mostly going to be critical, I want you to know that I'm like pretty inspired by the theory, and I agree in spirit, even if I don't agree in detail. Okay, so here's the 4 problems. The first one is basically this. Field wants to give a definition of truth for natural language, but natural language is a lot more complicated than Tarski and formal languages. In particular, there are plenty of sentences in natural language that are true, but their structure goes beyond what a Tarskian theory can explain. So just to give a few examples, there's other quantifiers like most cats are timid, generics, cats meow, modal sentences, it's possible that Momo is sleeping, and a whole host of others. And now, there are well-developed semantic theories for these other kinds of sentences. So for sentences involving most, it's called generalized quantifier theory. And for modal sentences, it's the possible world semantics. The problem, though, is how do you incorporate them into Field's theory? It seems like incorporating them into Field's theory is going to require a major overhaul. Take, for instance, most cats are timid. The standard truth conditional semantic interpretation of this sentence is Fregean, not Tarskian. The Fregean approach works by assigning each significant part of the sentence an entity, a denotation, as its meaning. And these denotations are typically objects, truth values, or functions, like truth functions, what would be represented by truth tables. So for example, cats would denote a function from objects of truth values that outputs true upon input of a cat. Are timid denotes a function from objects of truth values that outputs true upon input as something that's timid. Most would then denote a higher order function. Put into it the denotation of cats, and you get the denotation of most cats. This is also a higher order function. It takes input from functions from objects of truth values and outputs true if most of the objects that output true for the denotation of cats also output true for the input. Okay, it's a mouthful, but the only point that I want you to see is just that this is formally very distinct from Tarski's theory. Tarski's theory uses recursive rules to generate statements of truth conditions as theorems, whereas a Fregean theory uses functional application to explain semantic composition. The program of doing this, of assigning denotations, which are usually functions, to natural language expressions to explain semantic composition in natural language is an ongoing and fruitful enterprise. Indeed, it can explain the truth conditions of a wider variety of natural language sentences than the Tarskian approach. So I think that a broadly Fieldian theory has to incorporate it somehow. But the question is, how? How do semantic approaches other than Tarski's fit into a Fieldian approach to explaining truth? Okay, second problem. This actually gives rise to a second problem, ontological interpretation. So Field's original theory was neutral on ontology, and that was what was nice about it. But if we're going to bring in other semantic frameworks, well, some of these will come at the expense of a richer ontology. So the most notorious example of this, to get straight to the point, is the possible world semantics. So the semantic approach to modal language, it quantifies over points of evaluation that we call possible worlds. Now, within the context of a correspondence theory of truth, the question of ontological commitment gets more worrisome. Namely, do we have to believe that possible worlds exist in order to use the semantic theory? Okay. Third problem. Those two problems concerned the choice of semantic theory. This one concerns the theory of reference. Recall that Field, he was looking for a highly ambitious theory of reference. He was looking for something that looked like this. His hope lied in the idea that R could be spelled out in terms of causal relations between our representations and the reference. I mentioned that after Field's paper, there was a concerted effort to realize Field's vision. However, as the 1980s came to a close, it became apparent how difficult it would be to follow through with this project if reduction is the guiding aim. If the last half century has taught us anything in philosophy, it's that non-trivial reductive analyses of long contested notions are something of a philosopher's fantasy. So Hilary Putnam criticized Field's theory for being scientifically utopian. Moreover, I have to say that skepticism concerning this part of the theory in particular played a major role in motivating people away from the correspondence theory of truth. So deflationists like Paul Horwich, Stephen Leeds, and then 2 decades later, Hartree Field himself, basically came to realize that this was hopeless. And so they adopted a different view. So if it were true that a correspondence theory needs a definition of reference like this, then that's a major liability. I'm going to present one more objection. This one comes from Scott Soames. So recall that the reason why Field claimed that the Tarskian base clauses need supplementation is because the Tarskian base clauses merely state the reference facts, but they don't explain them. But if, like Field, we're looking for a general philosophical account of truth applicable to natural languages and thought, then it's not enough to merely list off the reference of each term. Since the referent facts are contingent and depend on how speakers use these terms, they require a more substantial account. However, a Fieldian correspondence theory only ever aims to provide that account for names and predicates. But why only the names and predicates? He takes the Tarskian recursive clauses basically as a given. But as Soames points out, Field's not entitled to this assumption. Given that his aim is to explain how the truth conditions of natural language sentences emerge from the facts of language use, he also needs to explain how the logical terms become endowed with their semantic contributions. To make this point vivid, compare 2 rivals for Tarskian clauses pertaining to the English word and. Phi and psi is true, if and only if phi is true and psi is true. Phi and psi is true, if and only if phi is true or psi is true. Okay, for English, the answer is obviously that A is correct. However, that this is so is a contingent fact about the English language, and it depends on how we use the word and. Analogous problems are also going to arise for the contributions of syntactic structure and also for the logical constants in thought. The lesson for us is that a reference-first theory, it's got to expand its horizons beyond Field's initial vision. In particular, it needs to account for the semantically significant syntax and logical terms. It also needs to basically give an explanation of what the medieval philosophers called the syncategorematic parts of language. Okay, so we now have a total of 4 problems for Field. And there are other problems which I might get to, but I think that these 4 in particular are worth focusing on because I think that they are symptomatic of a common underlying cause. Because, basically, I think that Field misconceived the relationship between semantic theories, of which Tarski's is an instance, and another project of explaining the semantic facts. Put it this way, Field essentially argues that the theory of truth should consist of two parts. There's like a division of labor in his theory. In his picture, the first part consists in a collection of recursive clauses that serve to define truth in terms of reference. And the second part consists of reducing reference to non-semantic relations like causation. I think Field is right that the theory of truth should be divided into two kinds of explanation. However, I think that Field carved the division in the wrong place. So contrary to Field, I think that a correspondence theory should not be conceived as a product of reducing truth to reference and then reference to non-semantic relations. Rather, it's the product of two explanatory endeavors, truth conditional semantics and a particular kind of metasemantic theory. This is my main thesis statement right here. Of course, in order for me to explain this, I'm going to have to define these terms. So the distinction between semantics and metasemantics, it comes originally from David Kaplan. Here's the original source. Kaplan writes, there are several interesting issues concerning what belongs to semantics. The fact that a word or phrase has a certain meaning clearly belongs to semantics. On the other hand, a claim about the basis for ascribing a certain meaning to a word or phrase does not belong to semantics. Osne means snow in Pig Latin. That's a semantic fact about Pig Latin. But the reason why Osne means snow is not a semantic fact. It is some kind of historical or sociological fact about Pig Latin. Perhaps because it's a fact about semantics, it's part of the metasemantics of Pig Latin. So semantics on this conception is about identifying the meaning facts, including the facts about reference and truth conditions. Whereas metasemantics is about explaining what determines those semantic facts. Now, there's plenty of different traditions in semantics. There are different ideas about what meaning is. But for the purposes of my talk, I don't really have to wade into those issues. I don't have to really be partisan. I can just say that there's really only one kind of semantic theory that interests me, and those are the ones that focus on truth conditions. A truth conditional semantic theory is one that specifies the truth conditions of infinitely many sentences of a language based on finitely many parts, or finitely many principles. There are several ways to do this. So the original Tarski method is an example. Tarski's definition provides semantic theories for particular formal languages. And then Frege's, whereby one assigns the phrases of the language denotations, that's another way of giving a semantic theory. Either way, semantic theories are rather abstract characterizations of a language. So for instance, this is a short semantic theory for part of my idiolect. It will report the facts that Momo refers to Momo, etc. The purpose of a semantic theory like this is not to explain why these facts are true. That's not their purpose. Semantics is thus a step removed from the mundane facts of human language use in psychology. Rather, the purpose of giving a theory like this is to explain how truth conditions are structured. How from finitely many meanings, you can get infinitely many truth-evaluable sentences. Semantics is thus a vital component of an overall account of truth. But it's not the only component. So metasemantics, by contrast, is concerned with actual language use in psychology. Whereas a semantic theory will report the fact that the name Momo refers to Momo, metasemantics will seek to explain why my individual uses tokens of Momo refer to Momo, as opposed to something else, say the moon or the number 5. Whenever I use the word Momo, there must be something about the production of my tokens and my relations to Momo herself that explain this reference relation. And that's squarely within the purview of metasemantics. David Lewis, in 1975, he dramatizes this contrast. First, he asks, what is a language? And then, speaking as a semanticist, he says, A language is an abstract function that maps expression types to denotations and sentences to sets of possible worlds. And then he asks, what is language? And then speaking as a sociologist, he says, it's a convention-governed social phenomena. Now, as a philosopher, we can ask, what have languages to do with language? So imagine a subject making various utterances and computing with various mental representations. What features of their verbal activity and cognitive situation determine that their utterances or representations satisfy one semantic theory rather than any other? So Lewis's own answer to this question stands in polar opposition to Field's. In Lewis's view, the semantic features of expressions are determined by holistic interpretational schemes. The correct scheme is determined by first assigning propositions to each subject's psychological attitudes, their beliefs and desires. And propositions are understood as sets of possible worlds, namely the possible worlds in which they are true. Then, given each person's beliefs and desires, Lewis then uses a theory of linguistic conventions to assign meanings to the sentences of natural language. Then finally, after that, given the meanings of sentences, he then explains how to get the denotations of words and predicates, or like of words, names and predicates. The approach is thus top-down. For Lewis, truth comes before reference in the overall order of explanation. This top-down approach is incompatible with the idea that truth is explained by reference. In fact, on Lewis's approach, it's arguable that truth has to be primitive because for him, it's the fundamental semantic notion. Lewis is not the only one who holds a top-down view. Similar ideas are also found in Davidson, and they continue to be defended by the followers of Lewis and Davidson, most recently by Robert Williams. This top-down order of determination, it notoriously gives rise to indeterminacy worries. If reference is just whichever relation that generates the right truth conditions, then arguably it's going to be underdetermined. Putnam argued this in the early 1980s. Basically, suppose you have a set of sentences and all you're told is that they're true, but you don't yet know what the words mean. From this, you're supposed to determine what the words mean. It turns out if there's one way to do this, then there's many ways to do this. And so if this is how semantic properties are determined, then reference is indeterminate. Our words have no determinate meanings. As I speak, there's right now a tremendous amount of effort being poured into the top-down approach to try to save it from this disastrous outcome. Top-down theorists will typically propose further constraints to try to pin reference down. But their success at this project is very much like an open question that's currently being debated. However, we could just avoid this problem altogether by taking the opposite metasemantic orientation. Instead of saying that reference is determined after truth, we may instead adhere to the constraint that semantic features are always determined from the bottom up. Indeed, let's introduce this as an explicit metasemantic principle. Reference grounds truth. The truth conditions of a token sentence representation, S, is explained by which objects its subsentential singular terms refer to and predicates apply to. So this principle belongs to metasemantics rather than semantics because semantics taken by itself merely reports the meanings of simple expressions and the derivational rules for complex ones. As such, it doesn't impose any particular explanatory order. It tells us, reference grounds truth, on the other hand, this superimposes on top of any semantic theory a particular explanatory order, an order of determination. It tells us that reference plays a more fundamental role than truth in explaining why a subject's utterances or mental representations are endowed with the semantic features that they have. So Lewis asks, what have languages to do with language? This principle would respond with the opposite of Lewis's answer. It says that a subject's token singular terms and predicates are produced with referential ties to worldly objects and features, and that these ties provide the basis that determines the overall semantic interpretation of their idiolect, or their system of mental representations. I think that this principle has the character that if you just look at it at first glance, it might look fairly commonsensical, or like might be an item of common sense. It's what you might naively expect to be the governing principle of semantic determination. However, when you look at the philosophical literature, you'll find that, in fact, there's a lot of mixed opinion. That's because this principle makes a completely universal conjecture. It says that reference is always more fundamental than truth. And as we'll see later, this will receive some pushback in some corners. So I propose that this principle, this metasemantic orientation, is the core idea in the spirit of the Field 1972 paper. And in fact, if you look at the contemporary literature, it often seems that people have already taken to implicitly assuming this, whether or not they agree with the correspondence theory or truth. So this principle is already associated with the correspondence tradition. And I think for good reason. This principle plausibly gives voice to the common intuition shared by correspondence theorists. Correspondence theorists say that truth depends on how things stand in the world, that it's a relation between representations and reality. Well, one way to precisify this thought is by saying that sentential truth is determined by subsentential word-world connections, that the truth of Momo sleeps stands or falls depending on how things are with Momo and whether or not she's sleeping. So in a slogan, correspondence truth is mediated by reference. All right, let me contrast this with Field. Both Field and I think of the theory of truth as coming in two parts. However, the parts are different. For Field, the first part is a definition of truth in terms of reference, provided by Tarski's recursive clauses. And the second is a definition of reference in terms of non-semantic relations. I, on the other hand, think that a correspondence view of truth is a product of two explanatory endeavors. The first is truth conditional semantics, and the second is truth conditional metasemantics that follows the reference first orientation. As such, Field and I assign different roles to semantic theory. For Field, the purpose of the semantic theory, like Tarski's, was to give an explicit analysis or definition of truth. I think that semantics plays a rather different role. According to the reference grounds truth principle, there's a real dependence relation between sentential truth and subsentential reference. For me, the role of the semantic theory, like Tarski's or Fraga's or possible world semantics, it's to model that real dependence relation. And when I say model, I don't mean model in the technical sense, in the formal, like a formal model. Rather, I mean model as it's used in the natural sciences. That is, they provide an idealized theoretical representation of this dependence relation. When we create a model of something, so in this sense, a model is a representational instrument. When we create a model of something, we create an idealized, simplified version of it because doing so is fruitful for explaining it. So for example, Tarski's original theory is extremely fruitful for representing how truth depends on reference for the fragment of natural language that can be translated into quantifier logic. A Fregean semantic theory provides another model, which captures a wider variety of natural language sentences, including sentences like most cats are timid. Seeing things in this way allows me to quickly set aside the first two problems for Field. So first, if semantic theories serve a modeling role, then there's nothing wrong with calling on different frameworks to semantics to explain different kinds of sentences. Tarskian theories can have a part to play, and Fregean theories can too. Hence, there's no problem with incorporating a diversity of competing frameworks into our overall understanding of truth. Secondly, I mentioned earlier that incorporating more powerful semantic theories will carry a worry about ontological commitment. Most notoriously, the standard semantics for modal language includes points of evaluation we call possible worlds. And if you're constructing a correspondence theory, someone's going to worry about your ontology. Do we have to believe that possible worlds exist to explain modal truth? Doesn't this lead down the rabbit hole of spooky metaphysics? And in my view, the answer is just straightforwardly no. Or at least it doesn't follow from the commitments of the theory of truth. You can believe in possible worlds if you like, but that would have to come from independent metaphysical considerations, not the theory of truth. That is because, in my view, the possible world semantics for modal sentences is essentially a modeling device. It serves to represent how the truth of modal sentences systematically depend on subsentential reference. Introducing possible worlds within the formalism serves important purposes within the specific aims and constraints of the theory, but appreciating this point does not demand that we revise our opinions on ontology for the sake of a correspondence theory. It is a standard point about scientific models that they may invoke unreal elements as instruments to serve their explanatory aims. Physicists will talk about frictionless planes and objects with zero volume, and similarly, semanticists may talk about possible worlds without any presumption that they're to be taken as real. Okay, so that answers the first, there's like a quick answer to the first two objections. I'll also say quickly that my modification was designed with Soames' objection in mind. Soames basically criticizes Field for neglecting the metasemantics of the syncategorematic expressions, like the logical terms. And in order to even begin to have an answer, you have to see the picture as including a metasemantics for all parts of language, not just a theory of reference for names and predicates. Now, of course, there's very deep and difficult questions about the metasemantics of logical terms. And it would take me too far afield to get into them, but suffice to say that everyone faces these problems, and whereas Fields like neglects it, at least my theory my picture opens the door to it. Okay, but what I really want to get to is the last objection, Field's scientific utopianism. So Field was looking for a ridiculously ambitious theory of reference. He wanted to replace Tarski's base clauses with a reductive analysis of this form. And the problem is that such a theory is pretty much hopeless. Actually, Field himself came to appreciate this later. So Field only advocated for the correspondence theory in the 1970s, but by the 1990s, he had changed his mind in favor of deflationism. Deflationism is the position that truth can't really be given a deep account. Instead, deflationists say that there's nothing more to say about truth other than platitudes. It appears that Field's primary reason for abandoning the correspondence theory had to do with this issue right here. It was about what it takes to adequately explain reference. So this raises the question, does a correspondence theory necessarily need the kind of account that Field was looking for? Well, why did Field think that this was necessary? Well, there are two reasons, and both of them stem from his ulterior philosophical motivations. First, he was looking for an explicit definition of truth, something that has the form of an analysis that doesn't mention any semantic terms on the right-hand side, an explicit definition. And secondly, he was looking for such a definition because he was motivated by physicalism, the doctrine that everything's ultimately made of atoms, quarks, and physical forces. I'm just going to say rather dogmatically that both of these ambitions strike me as old-fashioned. So consider the first one. Field wanted a closed-form theory statable in a finite number of principles with no ends left untied. But since he didn't analyze reference, he never accomplished this. In contrast, I believe that a view on truth ought to be open-textured. Instead of seeking a definition of truth, we ought to instead call the aim of a philosophical theory a picture or a conception. A conception will be characterized by the principles that it upholds. In particular, a reference-first view will be characterized by that reference grounds truth metasemantic orientation that I mentioned earlier. And in addition to the core principles, it's acceptable for a view to leave some things open-ended and delegate tasks to ongoing specialized lines of inquiry. In the contemporary scene, one of the leading advocates of the correspondence view is Gila Scher, and Scher often stresses that the correspondence view ought to be dynamic. It ought to evolve as we better understand the semantics of living, evolving natural languages. Also, as we better improve our understanding of the mechanisms of mental representation. So we shouldn't try to pigeonhole truth into a succinct definition like this right from the get-go. As I see it, we can have an open-ended picture that still substantially fulfills the task of a theory of truth. A theory of truth ultimately aims to explain what truth is and how it is determined. To this end, we make substantial progress by seeing the explananda as partitioned into several subproblems. By seeing truth as explicable through truth-conditional semantics and a reference-first orientation, we get a picture that provides a recipe for explaining each and every truth. As for Field's second reason, we must ask, is it really true that if it were impossible to explicate the notion of truth and reference in non-semantic terms, we'd have to either give up these semantic terms or else reject physicalism? The doctrine of physicalism itself has been subjected to a lot of scrutiny since Field wrote this. And I'm pretty confident in saying that Field is wrong about this. We can be physicalists in some sense, even if we can't explicitly define the terms of the special sciences in physical terms. So the classic paper to make this point was Jerry Fodor's paper, Special Sciences. Basically, like, what does it mean to say that everything's ultimately made of atoms? Does it mean that we can give a definition of tables, chairs, people, friendships, or reference in physical terms? No. It just means that the sum total of physical facts somehow determine the non-physical facts. And it's quite difficult to spell out what this determination amounts to. However, this is not a problem unique to semantics or the theory of truth. Everybody, biologists, economists, semanticists, will have to invoke some specialized terms that are not definable in terms of a lower level science. And doing so is justified by the role these terms play in facilitating explanations. So the inability to define reference in non-semantic terms is not a good objection to the correspondence theory per se. Okay, so I just said that I don't think that reference can be defined in non-semantic terms. Am I admitting that reference can't be defined at all? Not really. On the contrary, I think the picture I'm offering gives the ingredients for a compelling non-reductive understanding of reference. Once we distinguish semantics from metasemantics, we see that Field's desired theory actually ran together two tasks that actually should have been kept apart. Field is not alone in this mistake. I think it was common in this time period. His desired theory sought to explain what reference is and how it is determined. That is, it aimed to explain the nature of the reference relation by way of definition, general definition, while simultaneously explaining how each referring term latches onto its particular referent. So take the fact that Momo refers to Momo. Intuitively, there's two different things to explain here. The first one is, what is the nature of this reference relation that occurs in this fact? And the second thing is, what determines that Momo refers to Momo rather than something else, like some other cat or a chair, the number 2? So let's call the first task the nature of reference, and the second task the determination question. I propose that a reference-first theory can just tackle these questions separately. Both of them are in the purview of metasemantics because they're both questions about semantic facts, but they're different kinds of questions. It's now widely agreed that real definition, or saying what something is a distinct form of explanation from grounding, explaining what determines it to be the case. And this point should hold for metasemantics too. So we should tackle these questions separately. So let's take the determination question first. Why does Momo refer to Momo? rather than something else, rather than like a table or a chair or another cat. To answer this, the reference first theorist is constrained by RGT. This means they have to work from the bottom up. If reference is to ground truth, then whatever grounds reference cannot depend on truth. Hence, the explanation for any given term must proceed without presupposing the truth conditions of any sentences in which the term partakes. The explanations they must be atomistic then, as opposed to holistic, meaning they have to pertain to terms taken individually. This is actually a fairly audacious conjecture because the same has to hold for all terms. Holistic theories that work from the top down are off the table. This is why my view receives pushback. However, for the Momo example, all the plausible stories are still on the table. So presumably, the reason why my word Momo refers to Momo rather than some other cat or this chair or a table has to do with my referential intentions, and then prior to that, my history of perceiving Momo. For other terms and other representations, we may have to give quite different stories. The reference first answer to the determination question is thus permitted to be pluralistic. This is a good thing. We achieve reference in so many different ways: perceptual relations, introspection, social deference, description, and so on. And given this variety, it really would be hopeless to look for a one-size-fits-all theory. Noam Chomsky was famously skeptical about semantics. He famously argued that the reference relation cannot be scientifically theorized because referents are typically unscientific. Most of the things that we think and talk about aren't scientifically tractable objects carved out by nature. Rather, we talk about objects that are delineated by our own human interests. But a reference-first theory with a pluralistic metasemantics is well suited to handle this observation. According to the present view, non-scientific reference, for instance, reference to socially constructed kinds, need not share any common grounds with scientific reference. We can expect these grounds to comprise elements of our social reality. Okay, so in summary, reference determination should be pluralistic and open-ended. And I think that's really how it should be. The only constraint is that it abides by that reference grounds truth orientation. That's what gives the theory some substance. What about the nature of reference itself? What is the reference relation? Well, on this question, I'm sympathetic to something that Kripke said in Naming a Necessity. He quotes Bishop Butler saying, "Everything is what it is and not another thing." In the non-trivial sense that philosophical analyses of some concept like reference in completely different terms, which make no mention of reference, are very apt to fail. However, saying this much does not mean that you can't give any informative account whatsoever. It's widely recognized that as an alternative to reduction, some things are best characterized by the roles they perform, rather than their intrinsic features. Thus, you can characterize something by tracing its function or role, and then define what it is by specifying what it does. So to give like a really overused example, what's the definition of a mousetrap? Well, it would be wrong to try to define what a mousetrap is by saying it's a thing that's made of wood and it has a spring, because that doesn't capture all the mousetraps. Rather, what is a mousetrap? It's a thing that catches mice. So it's defined by what it does. So this is how I propose we understand reference from the reference first perspective. In my view, we can pretty much capture all there is to say about reference by way of definition by tracing its function within semantics, that is, its connection to truth and meaning. I think that a main attraction, actually a selling feature, or maybe even an argument for my view, is that it assigns a consistent explanatory role for both reference and for the truth conditional formal semantic theories. This is made available by the reference grounds truth principle. As I said earlier, truth conditional semantics taken by itself, it's in the business of reporting the systematic connections between meanings of simple expressions and the truth conditions of whole sentences. Formal semantic theories model these connections by giving a finite assignment of denotations to the simple expressions that entail infinitely many theorems about truth conditions. But we can ask, what do formal semantic theories represent? What underlying phenomena are they theories of? If we adhere to the reference first view, we get a simple unifying answer to this question. The answer is that there's this real dependence relation, namely the truth depends on the referential features of words, and the purpose of a formal semantics is to capture this dependency. In other words, formal semantic theories are meant to model or represent such pre-theoretic facts as these. The reference-first orientation thus expresses a desirable unity of purpose to the formal semantic theories delivered by semantics. If, on the other hand, we rejected the reference-first orientation, then we can't give this answer. Then we'd have to face the difficult question of what else a truth-conditional semantic theory could be regarded as explaining. So this is an argument for my view. Secondly, semantics by itself, as I said earlier, it's not designed to explain how or why any given term refers to what it does. It'll tell you that Momo sleeps is true if and only if Momo is sleeping. But it won't tell us why tokens of Momo refer to Momo or why tokens of sleeps apply to those that sleep. This is why questions about reference fixation are sometimes called pre-semantic. They're like come before the semantic theory. If we adhere to my view, then we give reference a single explanatory function in relation to semantics. Namely, it provides the basic inputs for semantic composition. It links objects to terms for the purpose of explaining how the truth values of sentences depend on the properties of things. Consider once again, Momo sleeps. This sentence is true or false depending on whether Momo is sleeping. Its truth value doesn't depend on whether any other thing is sleeping. But why is it Momo specifically that this sentence's truth value depends on? The answer is provided by reference. That's its explanatory role. So here's this role expressed in more generality for singular terms. I think that it's a striking fact about reference that the most conspicuous way to say what it is to outline what it does in relation to other semantic properties like truth. So this makes like a functionalist count, I think, fairly plausible. So my proposal is that this role, along with an analogous principle linking predicate reference to truth, pretty much tells us all we need to know about reference in general for the sake of the correspondence theory. Okay, so I've just laid out basically all the nuts and bolts of my view. I'm a little bit over, but I will tell you who disagrees with me. So I'm going to end this talk by just situating my view within the contemporary scene. So if we take the reference first orientation, a metasemantic orientation, as the defining feature of a philosophical conception of truth, what then are going to be the rivals? Well, the rivals are going to be distinguished by their competing conceptions of metasemantic orientation. I've already talked about the top-down view, the interpretationist. Donald Davidson, David Lewis, and Robert Williams. So they hold that meaning is determined from the perspective of an ideal interpreter. So they take a top-down approach whereby truth is determined prior to reference. Further, for them, reference relations are artifacts of the interpretational schemes that we use to understand one another. Davidson once wrote that reference has no empirical meaning outside of the context of an interpretational scheme, a theory we use to interpret each other's words. Besides this, so we've got like a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. Besides this, there's two other ways for truth and reference to relate. You could take a no priority view in which neither of them have priority. And I think that this view is attributable to at least the mainstream versions of deflationism. Deflationism by Klein, Stephen Leeds, Paul Horwich, and then Hartree-Field after he abandoned the other view. So deflationists generally take that truth and reference are explicable by the sum total of instances of trivial schemas, like snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. They say that's really all there is to say about the truth of that sentence. I've actually already compared my view to deflationism in a paper in 2022, in a Phil Quarterly paper. So see that for a paper where I argue that my view undercuts the motivations for deflationism and is generally preferable. Finally, my biggest competitor right now is perhaps the pluralists. Crispin Wright, Michael Lynch, and Douglas Edwards. So truth can come before reference always, or reference before truth always. Pluralists take the mixed view that sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. So they endorse a mixed metasemantics, whereby the reference grounds truth orientation prevails for some classes of truths, but not others. So for instance, Lynch and Edwards uphold the reference first correspondence theory, but just for truths about perceptible material objects, like cats. But then they reverse the order of explanation for truths in other domains. Lynch proposes a truth-first approach to moral truth, and Edwards gives a truth-first account of socially constructed truths. So overall, truth has a bottom-up structure for some topics and a top-down structure for others. Unfortunately, it would take like a second talk for me to explore the competition between their views and mine. All I can say is a few words about the dialectical situation. I just want to say right off the bat that the pluralist theories like this, they come with an upfront cost. This goes back to one of the main arguments I gave for my view. By adhering to the reference grounds truth principle, we can hypothesize an intuitive and unified explanandum to the theories of truth conditional semantics. What does a Tarskian or Fregean theory of semantic composition represent? The answer afforded by my view is that these theories model a real dependence relation between truth and reference. However, the mixed views of Lynch and Edwards, they cannot say this. They have to see semantics as having an inherently disjointed subject matter. Sometimes it represents truth to reference dependence, and sometimes it represents something else. This is kind of like how our term jade doesn't refer to a single natural kind. Rather, there's two chemically distinct minerals, jadeite and nephrite, and we just so happen to use the word jade for both of them, kind of by a fluke, an accident. Well, they kind of look similar, but there's no underlying thing that unites jade. Well, I think that semantics for the pluralists has to be kind of like jade. There's multiple distinct phenomena in language that theorists accidentally lump together under the common heading of truth conditional semantics. I think that this results unattractive. So all of this goes to say that I think that my view should have a kind of default status or default presumption, and their views have the burden of proof. And of course, me saying this doesn't settle anything because they have arguments for their view. But defending my view against theirs, that's a problem for another time. Suffice to say that when it comes to this debate between all these competing pictures, the reference first picture, interpretationism, deflationism, and pluralism, there aren't really any knockdown arguments anymore. None of these views can be refuted by a single objection. Instead, we have to turn to holistic considerations about which perspective provides the better picture overall. And it's the nature of these debates that they can't be settled in a short space. Nonetheless, I hope that I've still accomplished something in this talk, because even though I haven't tried to settle the debate in favor of my view, I've at least explained why the reference first correspondence view inspired by Field is still viable and indeed an attractive option, and like why it's still on the table. Anyway, thank you.